The fog clung thickly to the grounds of Thornapple Cottage, as though it knew the secrets buried within its stone walls. Miss Marple stood at the gate, her keen eyes scanning the dark windows, a sense of unease prickling her spine. She'd been invited by an old friend, but the atmosphere around the cottage felt wrong. Something hidden in the shadows, something she could not yet name, was waiting. The house seemed to breathe, a silent witness to a crime yet to unfold, and Miss Marple, ever so perceptive, could feel it. There was danger here. But what and from whom she had yet to discover? Chapter 1. The Invitation. The air was crisp as the small carriage jolted over the cobbled roads leading to Thornapple Cottage. Miss Marple sat quietly, her sharp eyes glancing out of the window, taking in the familiar countryside view. She had received a peculiar invitation just days earlier, handwritten and sealed with an elegant wax stamp, a rare sight in this modern age. The note had come from an old acquaintance, a former neighbor from her youth, Lady Eleanor Wren. It was a strange letter, laden with a tone of urgency, yet cloaked in an odd formality. Dear Miss Marple, I implore you to visit Thornapple Cottage at your earliest convenience. Strange happenings have occurred, and I find myself in need of your assistance. Please do not delay. I trust you will understand the gravity of my request. The rest of the letter was rather vague, but the appeal was enough to spark Miss Marple's curiosity. As the carriage pulled up to the gate of Thornapple Cottage, she was immediately struck by the eerie stillness of the place. The cottage, nestled on the edge of the moors, looked like something from a forgotten time. The ivy-covered walls and moss-clad roof seemed almost alive, as though the house itself was hiding secrets beneath its weathered exterior. The cottage had once been the pride of Lady Eleanor's family, but now it appeared to have fallen into disrepair. The once immaculate gardens had grown wild, and the windows stared blankly at the world, as if refusing to welcome anyone. Miss Marple stepped out of the carriage, her senses heightened by the quietness that enveloped the place. The door to the cottage opened slowly, revealing Lady Eleanor, her frail form draped in a long dark shawl. The years had not been kind to her once vibrant face now marked by the passage of time. But her eyes still sparkled with the intelligence and grace Miss Marple remembered. "Ah, Miss Marple," Lady Eleanor greeted her warmly, though there was an unmistakable tremor in her voice. "I'm so glad you could make it. I didn't know who else to turn to." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It's always a pleasure to see you, Lady Eleanor. But I must admit, your letter has intrigued me. What is this urgent matter you speak of?" Lady Eleanor glanced around nervously before ushering Miss Marple inside. The cottage was dimly lit with the scent of old books and dust in the air. It was apparent that the place had not been properly cared for in some time. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the upper floors, though the house appeared empty. Once inside, Lady Eleanor led Miss Marple to a cozy sitting room with a large hearth crackling softly. There was something unsettling about the room, the way the shadows played on the walls and how the fire seemed to dance just a little too brightly. It was almost as if the house itself was watching them. "Please take a seat." Lady Eleanor gestured toward an armchair by the fire. "I'm afraid I have a rather troubling story to tell you." Miss Marple sat down, folding her hands in her lap, her mind already beginning to piece together the puzzle. "Go on, Lady Eleanor. I'm listening." Lady Eleanor hesitated, wringing her hands together nervously. "It all started a few weeks ago," she began. "At first it was nothing more than small, peculiar occurrences. An object misplaced, strange noises at night, But then there was a body. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A body? Yes, it was a terrible shock to everyone. The village was in an uproar. A young woman, Mary Adams, who had been staying here at the cottage under my care, was found dead in the garden. The police said it was an accident. She had fallen from the upper window. But I know there's more to it than that. Miss Marple leaned forward, her sharp instincts kicking into gear. And you think it was no accident? Lady Eleanor nodded, her face pale. I do. There's something about this house, Miss Marple. I can feel it, a malevolent presence. I fear it's not just Mary's death, but something far more sinister. And that's why I called you. You've always had a way of seeing things that others can't. Please, I need your help. Miss Marple sat in silence for a moment, her mind carefully processing the details. The quiet unease in Lady Eleanor's voice, the cryptic invitation, and now the mention of a death. She could sense the layers of mystery just beneath the surface. Of course, Lady Eleanor, Miss Marple said softly. I will help you. We'll get to the bottom of this together. As she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thornapple Cottage was holding more than just its fair share of secrets, and that the invitation had not been as innocent as it seemed. There was something lurking here, something dark that Miss Marple was determined to uncover. Lady Eleanor gave a relieved sigh. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me. But as Miss Marple gazed out the window, watching the wind rustle the tall grass in the garden, she couldn't help but feel that this visit to Thornapple Cottage would be far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. Chapter 2. The Gathering. The following morning, Miss Marple woke early, the light streaming through the small window of her guest room in Thornapple Cottage. The night had been unsettling, filled with the sound of strange creaks and whispers, as though the house itself was trying to communicate. Yet, despite the eerie atmosphere, she found herself more curious than frightened. She had learned over the years that mystery was often a puzzle waiting to be solved, and this was no different. Lady Eleanor had asked her to meet everyone at breakfast, but Miss Marple could sense that something was not quite right. The air seemed thick with tension, as if every word spoken would be analyzed, dissected, and used against the speaker. She made her way down the narrow staircase, her shoes clicking on the worn steps, and entered the dining room. The room was large, with an old wooden table that looked like it had been in the family for generations. The long windows allowed the morning sun to filter through, casting a golden glow on the mismatched chairs that surrounded the table. At the far end, Lady Eleanor sat, looking as composed as ever, though her eyes were heavy with concern. She motioned for Miss Marple to join her at the table. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, with a strained smile. "I trust you slept well?" "I did, thank you," Miss Marple replied, though she could not entirely suppress the unease that had crept into her chest. "It's quite a lovely house, despite the rather unsettling atmosphere." Lady Eleanor's lips tightened, but she said nothing, instead directing Miss Marple to sit across from her. There were already a few others at the table, each person wrapped in their own thoughts. The first person Miss Marple noticed was a tall, thin man with a strikingly handsome face, though it was marred by a permanent scowl. He was dressed in a dark suit, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though searching for something. This, Miss Marple noted, was Edward Wren, Lady Eleanor's nephew and the heir to the cottage. His presence seemed to give the room an air of discomfort, as if his mere existence unsettled everyone around him. Next to him was a woman with a delicate, almost fragile appearance. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she had the air of someone who spent more time in books than in the company of people. This was Catherine, Lady Eleanor's niece. She looked as if she would rather be anywhere else. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze directed at the tablecloth. Miss Marple could tell that Catherine was avoiding eye contact, a telltale sign of someone trying to hide something. At the far end of the table sat an older man with a thick beard, his face weathered by time and experience. His clothes were simple but functional, and he wore a look of quiet resignation. He was Thomas Braxton, a longtime servant at Thornapple Cottage, who had worked for the Wren family for decades. He seemed uncomfortable in the presence of so many guests, but remained silent, occasionally offering a grunt or a nod as others spoke. Miss Marple took a seat between Lady Eleanor and Edward, and immediately the conversation began. "Miss Marple," Lady Eleanor began, "this is Edward, my nephew, and his fiancée Catherine. You've met Thomas already, and then we have the others, my dear friend, Mrs. Margaret Blackwood, who is currently away for the day. She has asked for her apologies, but she'll return soon. But now I think we should discuss the matter at hand." Miss Marple took a moment to observe each person at the table. Lady Eleanor's gaze darted nervously between her guests, while Edward's eyes seemed to darken the longer he sat. Catherine barely moved, still avoiding eye contact, and Thomas's hands trembled slightly, though he kept his face as impassive as ever. "It's clear that something very strange is going on here," Miss Marple began, breaking the silence. "The events of the past few days, the death of Mary Adams, the strange happenings in this house, they all seem connected. But to understand what is truly happening, I need to know more about each of you." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Miss Marple did not press them immediately, but allowed her presence to fill the room, her calm demeanor forcing others to open up. It wasn't long before the first to speak was Catherine, her voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of fear. "I don't know why you're here, Miss Marple," Catherine said, her eyes flicking nervously toward Lady Eleanor. "This is all so ridiculous. Mary's death was an accident. It's all just coincidence?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "I understand your skepticism, Miss Wren, but sometimes the truth is hidden behind the things we wish to believe." She paused, her gaze moving from Catherine to Edward. "And I'm sure your fiancé agrees?" Edward's face tightened, but he remained silent, his cold eyes betraying a mix of frustration and something else. Something darker that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "I believe my aunt is right," Edward said suddenly, his voice low but firm. "This house has been in my family for generations, and I've never seen anything like this. There's something wrong here. I've seen it myself." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the mention of something wrong. "What exactly have you seen, Mr. Wren?" Edward shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've seen strange figures moving about the grounds at night. Figures that shouldn't be there. Shadows that move in ways they shouldn't. I thought I was imagining things, but now, with all that's happened, I'm not so sure." Miss Marple leaned forward, her mind racing. "And have these figures been seen by anyone else?" Edward's gaze flickered briefly to Thomas, who seemed to tense at the mention of the figures. But before he could speak, Lady Eleanor interrupted. "I'm afraid Thomas is not one to indulge in such nonsense," she said, her voice a little too sharp. "He's always been the practical sort." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but said nothing, choosing instead to observe the dynamics in the room. There was something very wrong here. something these people weren't willing to admit, but they were getting closer. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken truths. The breakfast continued in strained silence, each person seemingly lost in their own thoughts, and Miss Marple took note of every flicker of emotion, every subtle exchange. In the back of her mind, she knew that she was on the verge of discovering something vital. But for now, the answers would have to wait. Chapter 3. The Incident. The sun had set quietly over Thornapple Cottage, leaving the surrounding moors shrouded in a thick mist. The house, once full of life and laughter, now seemed to echo with an unsettling quiet. As Miss Marple sat in the sitting room, listening to the crackling of the fire, she couldn't shake the feeling that the place was haunted, not by ghosts but by the secrets buried within its walls. Lady Eleanor had retired to her room for the evening, and Catherine had withdrawn as well, claiming fatigue. Edward, however, had remained downstairs, pacing restlessly, his sharp eyes darting toward every corner of the room, as though he expected something or someone to jump out from the shadows. Miss Marple had spent the evening in quiet observation, studying the little nuances of the household's behavior. But it wasn't until the clock struck midnight that the tranquility was broken. The first sign was the faint, almost imperceptible sound of something or someone moving through the house. It was an odd sound, like the shuffle of bare feet on wooden floors, but it came from an area where no one had been. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught it first, and her eyes narrowed. She could feel the weight of the house's secrets pressing down on her, but she remained still, listening. Then came the second sound, the unmistakable crash of glass shattering, followed by a loud thud. Miss Marple's heart raced as she stood from her chair, her instincts immediately telling her that something was terribly wrong. She moved quickly through the house, her footsteps muffled on the thick carpet as she passed down the long hallway. She knew the layout of the cottage well enough to know that the sound had come from upstairs, near one of the guest rooms. With a quick glance, she saw Edward, his face pale, eyes wide with alarm, as he appeared from the stairway. "Miss Marple, what was that?" he asked breathlessly, his voice tight with fear. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was already halfway up the stairs, her mind working quickly to piece together what was happening. The night had taken a sinister turn, and she could feel the weight of it hanging in the air. She reached the top of the stairs and turned down the corridor, where the door to Lady Eleanor's room stood ajar. As she approached, the door creaked open, revealing the source of the disturbance. Lady Eleanor lay on the floor, unconscious, her face pale and her breathing shallow. A large shard of broken glass was embedded in the wall next to her, and the window, which should have been closed, was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the wind. The room smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something metallic like blood. "Lady Eleanor!" Miss Marple cried, rushing to her side. Edward was right behind her, his face a mask of concern. He knelt beside Lady Eleanor, checking for any signs of life. Miss Marple placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "She's alive, but just barely," Miss Marple murmured. "We need to get her to safety." Edward nodded, his eyes full of panic. "But what happened? Who did this?" Miss Marple's sharp gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors or windows, just the shattered glass from the now empty vase beside the bed. The room, despite its earlier disarray, held an eerie calm, now that Lady Eleanor was down. "I don't know yet," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet but firm, "but we must act quickly." She instructed Edward to fetch Thomas, the longtime servant, and bring him up to help move Lady Eleanor to a safer part of the house. As he hurried off, Miss Marple carefully examined the room, noting the open window. It was still a bit windy, and the curtains billowed like a specter caught in mid-flight. Yet, there were no other signs of struggle, no footprints in the dust, or signs of anyone sneaking in. Whoever had attacked Lady Eleanor had done so without leaving much behind. She turned her attention to the broken glass, noting the large shards scattered across the floor. One piece, however, stood out. A large, jagged piece, sharp and reflective, lay near the bed's edge. It had clearly come from the vase, but something about it felt wrong. Why was it so far from the others? Miss Marple picked it up cautiously, turning it over in her hands. "Strange," she muttered under her breath. "Too much glass. For just an accident." The mystery deepened as she realized that the attack on Lady Eleanor may not have been random at all. This was calculated. Someone had intended for this to happen. Suddenly, she heard hurried footsteps from behind. Thomas entered the room, followed closely by Edward. Together, they helped move Lady Eleanor carefully to the quieter corner of the house, away from the disturbance. Once Lady Eleanor was settled in a safer room, Miss Marple took a moment to gather her thoughts. She stood by the door, looking at the now closed window. A chill had settled into the room, and the mist outside seemed to be drawing closer, as if it too were trying to seep into the house. Edward's voice broke her concentration. "Do you think it was an accident? Was she attacked?" Miss Marple turned slowly, her eyes meeting Edward's with an intensity that made him flinch slightly. "This wasn't an accident, Mr. Wren," she said quietly. "Lady Eleanor was deliberately targeted." Edward's face paled further. "By whom?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the broken glass again, then to the open window. "That is the question, isn't it? I think it's time we started looking at everyone here very carefully." Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The hours after the incident passed in a blur of anxious whispers and hurried movements. Lady Eleanor, though still unconscious, had been settled into a room that had been hastily prepared for her safety. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, and the doctors who had been called in reported that she was in a stable condition, though they were unsure of what had truly caused her collapse. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious, and the broken glass by the window remained a mystery. Miss Marple stood by the window, the early morning light filtering through the heavy curtains. The house was quiet now, the chaos of the night dissipating into a tense, heavy silence. There were too many unanswered questions swirling around the estate, and Miss Marple knew that it was time to get to work. Her mind, sharp as ever, had already started piecing together the fragments of the puzzle, though she knew the path ahead would not be an easy one. Edward Wren had insisted on staying by his aunt's side, but it was clear that he was struggling to keep his composure. His usual aloofness was gone, replaced by an almost childlike anxiety. Catherine, on the other hand, had disappeared after the incident, retreating to her room without a word. Only Thomas, the long-serving butler, remained composed, his face as unreadable as ever. Miss Marple had already noted the way Thomas had kept his distance during the previous night's chaos, his silent presence perhaps hiding more than he was willing to reveal. Miss Marple knew she would need to talk to each of them, but she had to start with the basics. The pieces of the puzzle that were most easily accessible, the ones that could help establish a clearer picture of what had happened. She began by taking another careful look at the room where Lady Eleanor had been found. The details that had escaped her attention before were now jumping out at her. The slightly askew painting on the wall, the dust on the windowsill, the open window where the wind had been blowing in. Miss Marple took a few steps toward the window, examining the floor beneath it. The dust was disturbed, fresh tracks almost invisible had been made recently. Someone had been here after the window had been opened. Miss Marple knelt down, carefully running her fingers along the floor. The footprints were faint but unmistakable. They led toward the corner of the room where a small, ornate desk stood, its drawers slightly open. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting at the desk, but something about the way the drawers had been left ajar seemed deliberate. She opened the drawers one by one, feeling the weight of each one shift with every pull. Inside one of the drawers, Miss Marple found a small, crumpled letter. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a letter from a law firm in the city, addressed to Lady Eleanor. The letter seemed innocuous at first, just a formal communication about family matters and estate holdings. But then she saw it, a small note, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand at the bottom of the page. The matter is more urgent than you realize. You must act swiftly. Someone is watching the estate. Don't trust anyone. Make your decision quickly. Time is running out. The words sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. Lady Eleanor had been warned, but had she taken the advice seriously? Or had she ignored it as so many people did when they faced uncomfortable truths? Miss Marple tucked the letter back into her coat pocket and stood up, her mind racing. There was no doubt about it now. Lady Eleanor's life had been in danger long before the glass shattered in her room. Someone had been trying to send a message, and the attack on Lady Eleanor was only the beginning. The next step, Miss Marple knew, was to speak to everyone in the house, starting with the one person who seemed to know everything without saying much, Thomas, the butler. She found him in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up as he cleaned the dishes, looking every bit the devoted servant. His back was to her, and he didn't turn as she approached. "Thomas," she began quietly, "we need to talk." He paused, the sound of the dishcloth in his hands halting abruptly. Without turning around, he replied, "What is it, Miss Marple?" "I know you know more than you're saying," she said bluntly, her voice calm but firm. "About the house, about Lady Eleanor, about the people who come and go. You've seen it all, haven't you?" Thomas let out a slow, deep breath before turning to face her. His eyes, though lined with age, were sharp, his expression unreadable. "I've been in this house a long time, Miss Marple. Seen many things, yes, but some things are better left undisturbed." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "This is not something that can be ignored. Lady Eleanor is in danger, and I need to know everything. You owe it to her, Thomas. Don't you want to protect her?" For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then slowly he nodded. "It's not just her life I'm worried about," he muttered almost to himself. "There are others. There's a lot more happening here than you realize." "What do you mean?" Miss Marple pressed. "There are people who would do anything to get their hands on Thornapple Cottage, Miss Marple. The estate isn't just a house, it's a legacy. And some people will go to any length to claim it." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "Who are these people, Thomas? Who would harm Lady Eleanor?" He hesitated, but then something in his eyes softened. "I don't know all the names, but there's been talk, whispers, about Edward, about Catherine, even about my own role in things. Things have changed in this house, Miss Marple, and some of the changes aren't for the better." That was all he said before he turned back to the sink, his hands once again busy with the dishes. But Miss Marple had heard enough. She left the kitchen, her mind already piecing together the web of deceit that surrounded Thornapple Cottage. Thomas's words echoed in her ears. There are people who would do anything to get their hands on Thornapple Cottage. Miss Marple knew that the web was now fully spun. She had the motive, the means, and the suspicion, but she needed more. There was one last place she had to visit, Lady Eleanor's study. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The day had barely begun, yet Thornapple Cottage felt as though it had already been through 100 storms. The fog that clung to the windows seemed to mirror the tension in the air. It was an odd feeling, like something was about to crack wide open. Miss Marple could feel the weight of it in her bones. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but she knew that the final revelation would shake everything and everyone to their core. She stood by the window, gazing out at the garden, which was still damp from the night's mist. The morning sun had begun to burn through the fog, casting long shadows across the property. The atmosphere was eerily calm, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She had a strange sense of foreboding, and for a brief moment, she wondered whether Lady Eleanor's letter had been a warning too late. If only she had acted sooner. But there was no turning back now. Miss Marple had spent the morning piecing together the story from the fragments she had gathered. The letter from the law firm, Thomas's cryptic warnings, the unsettling conversations with Edward and Catherine, all of it had pointed her in one direction. But there was one person left to speak with before she could draw her conclusions. Lady Eleanor. Lady Eleanor was sitting by the fire when Miss Marple entered her room, looking frail and pale but still very much aware of her surroundings. She had regained consciousness late last night, but it was clear that the ordeal had taken a toll on her. Her face was drawn, her eyes tired, but her mind was sharp. Miss Marple, she greeted her, her voice weak but steady. I knew you'd come to me. I know you must have figured it out by now. Miss Marple's eyes softened. I've gathered some information, Lady Eleanor, but I still don't understand why someone would want to harm you. Your family, your legacy. What happened? Lady Eleanor's lips trembled slightly, but she didn't hesitate. It's all my fault, Miss Marple. I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but I didn't know how to stop it. The estate, it's been under threat for months. A group of people, outsiders, they wanted control of Thornapple Cottage, but they knew I wouldn't give up my home easily. So they began to plot. At first, it was subtle, financial pressures, threats, but then she hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as though making sure no one else could hear. Then they turned to my family. Miss Marple took a step forward, her heart racing. Who are these people, Lady Eleanor? Why target your family? Lady Eleanor swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's my nephew, Edward, and Catherine, my niece. She lowered her voice even further. They were both involved in the plot, but they were unaware of the full extent of it. At least I thought they were. Edward wanted to secure his future. He's always been ambitious, and Catherine, poor thing, she was just too impressionable, too eager to please him. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still made her heart sink. Edward and Catherine? Lady Eleanor nodded, her face drawn in deep sorrow. Yes, they were both being manipulated, though they didn't realize it. There were promises of wealth and power in exchange for turning over control of the estate. I tried to warn them, tried to stop them from getting involved with the wrong people, but it was too late. But who are these outsiders? Miss Marple pressed, her voice tight with urgency. Who are the people behind all this? Lady Eleanor sighed deeply. They're part of a syndicate, an underground group that deals in acquiring estates like this. They've been buying up properties across the countryside, forcing out the rightful owners. But they needed my signature, my consent, to make it official. When I refused, they resorted to more drastic measures. Miss Marple's mind raced. It was all beginning to make sense now. The threats, the manipulation, it was all part of a larger scheme. But one thing didn't sit right with her. "And Mary Adams?" she asked. "How does she fit into this?" Lady Eleanor's eyes clouded with confusion. Mary was my companion. She was like a daughter to me, but she found out something. Something about the plot, I'm sure. I don't know if she knew about the syndicate, but she was the one who saw the truth. And when she tried to warn me, they silenced her. "The accident?" Miss Marple murmured, piecing it all together. "Mary didn't fall, did she?" "It wasn't an accident at all." Lady Eleanor's face crumpled, and she shook her head. "No, they pushed her. She knew too much. I should have protected her, but I didn't understand how far they were willing to go." Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her mind whirling. Everything pointed back to one terrifying truth. The danger had been lurking within Thornapple Cottage all along, not just from the people who had threatened Lady Eleanor, but from the very family she had tried to protect. Edward and Catherine had been pawns, but they had been pawns with motives of their own. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock on the door. Edward stood in the doorway, his face pale and his expression strained. He looked every bit the man torn between guilt and a desperate need for redemption. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice shaking, "I need to speak with you." But Miss Marple wasn't going to let him off so easily. "Edward," she said, her voice cold and sharp, "you need to hear the truth." "All of it." He hesitated, glancing nervously at Lady Eleanor, who nodded faintly, giving him permission to enter. He stepped into the room, his eyes shifting between Miss Marple and his aunt, who was now visibly upset. "I don't understand," Edward said, his voice rising. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't have anything to do with this. Don't lie to me, Edward," Miss Marple said, her voice steely. "I know what you've done. The people you've been meeting with, the promises you made, it's all coming to light now. You were trying to sell your aunt's estate behind her back, weren't you? You were going to let these people take it from her." Edward's face twisted with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "No, you don't understand. Everything I've done, I did for us, for our future. This house, it's a burden. It's falling apart. We need money, and..." "Enough," Miss Marple cut him off. "You were willing to destroy your own family for the promise of wealth. And you dragged your sister into it as well, didn't you?" Catherine had entered the room at that moment, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Edward," she whispered, "what have you done?" The room went deathly silent. It was clear now that the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Edward's ambition had driven him to seek out dangerous alliances, and Catherine had been swept up in the chaos. But neither of them could escape the consequences of their actions. Miss Marple stood tall, her eyes narrowing. "Lady Eleanor was right all along," she said quietly but firmly. "You and your sister were both caught in a trap you didn't understand. But now, the truth is out, and it's time to face it."